The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Silas Crow had already told 3 different men that the Callahan Ranch would be his before the end of the month. He didn't whisper it. He said it at the counter of Dawson's Feed and Supply, loud enough for the clerk to hear, loud enough for the widow Mathers buying flour in the corner to go pale and look away. He said it the way a man says something he's already decided is done. Not a boast, not a threat, just a fact he was tired of keeping to himself. The Callahans owed him $412 on a note that had been sitting in his desk drawer for 2 years. And now the railroad survey had come through, and that land along Copper Creek was suddenly worth 6 times what anyone had imagined. And Silas Crow did not believe in coincidences. He believed in timing. He believed in being the only man in the room who already knew what the room was worth. He gave Wyatt Callahan 30 days to repay every cent. Not because the law required it, because 30 days was enough time to make a man desperate, and desperate men made mistakes, and Crow had built his entire operation on the mistakes of desperate men. What he did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that a woman was stepping off a train in Magdalena that same Friday afternoon, carrying a carpet bag with a broken clasp and a letter of introduction to a man who had been dead for 4 months. If you have ever arrived somewhere expecting one life and found an entirely different one waiting, subscribe to this channel, because this story is for you. Hit the like button, leave a comment with your city and country so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with me until the very end. You will not want to miss what happens next. The train did not slow gracefully into Magdalena. It shuddered, hissed, and lurched to a stop the way an exhausted animal drops to its knees, without ceremony, without apology. Evelyn Hart gripped the seat back in front of her and waited for the rocking to settle before she stood. She had been traveling for 11 days. She knew the number precisely because she had marked each one in the small leather notebook she kept in her coat pocket, the one her sister had pressed into her hands at the station in Philadelphia, with tears she was trying not to show. Evelyn had written the date at the top of each page, and then written almost nothing else, because there was very little to say about 11 days of train cars and depot waiting rooms, and the particular loneliness of eating a hard biscuit alone while watching families board and depart around you, like the world was full of people who knew exactly where they belonged. She was 31 years old. She had taught school for 7 years, lived in her sister's house for the last 3 of them, and answered an advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer placed by a rancher in New Mexico Territory named Daniel Callahan, who described himself as 34, widowed, owner of 400 acres along Copper Creek, and in possession of a daughter who needed a mother's influence. His letters had been plain and honest in a way that felt almost startling after years of men who dressed their intentions in borrowed poetry. Daniel Callahan wrote about his land the way a person writes about something they're proud of without needing to perform the pride. He wrote about his daughter Rose with a directness that told her more than he probably intended. That the child was the whole reason he had placed the advertisement, that he was not lonely so much as worried, that what he needed was not a companion, but a partner. Evelyn had liked him for that. She had written back, and they had exchanged 6 letters over 4 months, and at the end of those 4 months she had sold her small collection of books, packed what she owned into a carpet bag her brother-in-law had bought her as a going-away gift, and boarded a train west. She had not told her sister everything. She had not said that the school board had cut her position and given it to a younger woman from Connecticut whose uncle sat on the board. She had not said that she was tired of being the extra person in someone else's household, the one who folded herself smaller at every meal so there would be room for everyone else. She had not said that she was afraid. She had just kissed her sister's cheek and said she was going, and her sister had handed her the notebook, and that was the end of Philadelphia. The platform in Magdalena was dust and wood planking and a smell she couldn't immediately name, something animal and dry and mineral all at once, like the land itself was exhaling. There were maybe a dozen people around her, some boarding, some unloading freight, a man in a canvas coat arguing with a porter about a crate. Evelyn set her carpetbag down, pressed the broken clasp shut with her thumb, and looked around for Daniel Callahan. He had written that he would meet her. He had been very specific about it. He would be there with the wagon. They would drive out to the ranch before dark. Rose would have supper waiting. He had described himself as tall, dark-haired, wearing a brown hat with a bent brim on the left side, as though he'd sat on it once and never fully corrected the damage. She looked for a brown hat with a bent brim. The platform emptied around her. The train groaned and began to move again, continuing west towards somewhere she wasn't going. In 10 minutes, she was the only person left standing on the platform who didn't appear to have somewhere to be. She picked up her bag and went inside to the station agent's window. The man behind the glass was 50-ish, with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent decades in this particular quality of sunlight. He looked up when she approached, and she saw him take her in. The carpet bag, the traveling dress, the absence of anyone accompanying her. And something in his expression shifted in a way she didn't immediately understand. "I'm looking for Daniel Callahan," she said. "He was supposed to meet this train." The station agent looked at her for a moment without speaking. It was the kind of pause that meant something. "Ma'am," he said, and then stopped again. "He's a rancher, out along Copper Creek, I believe. Do you know him?" "I know of him," the man said carefully. "Miss, did you come from back east?" "Philadelphia." He took off his spectacles and set them on the counter. "When did you last receive a letter from Daniel Callahan?" The question landed wrong. Evelyn felt the skin on the back of her neck go cold before her mind fully processed why. 2 months ago, she said. "He wrote in April. He said he would meet this train." The station agent looked at the counter between them for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "Daniel Callahan died in February," he said. "Fever. He'd been sick since January, from what I heard." "I'm sorry, miss. I'm very sorry. I don't know why no one wrote to you." The platform outside was completely empty now. The sound of the departed train was gone. Somewhere down the street, something metal clanged against something else, and then went quiet. Evelyn stood at the window and said nothing. She was aware, in a very precise and almost clinical way, of several things simultaneously: that her legs were still holding her up, that the clasp on her carpet bag had come open again, that she had $6.40 in the small purse sewn into her corset, that she had no ticket back to Philadelphia, and that even if she had one, she did not entirely want to use it. "Is there a hotel?" she said. "Mrs. Garfield runs a boarding house on Front Street. It's clean." He paused. Do you have people here? Anyone you can contact?" "No," she said. "Thank you." She picked up her bag and walked out. The boarding house was exactly as advertised: clean, spare, smelling of lye soap and yesterday's beans. Mrs. Garfield was a compact woman in her 60s who did not ask unnecessary questions, which Evelyn was grateful for. She was given a room on the second floor with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the main street, and she sat on the edge of that bed for a long time without taking off her coat. She did the arithmetic the way she always did when she was frightened, methodically, starting with what she actually knew. $6.40. The room was 50 cents a night. She had the clothes in the bag and the notebook and a small folding knife her brother-in-law had insisted on at the last minute, embarrassed about it, pressing it into her hand and saying only that a woman traveling alone ought to have one. She had no position waiting for her anywhere. She had no family in New Mexico territory. She had come to marry a man who was already in the ground. The thing she kept returning to, sitting on that narrow bed in the last light of a Friday afternoon, was not the catastrophe of her situation. It was the April letter. Daniel Callahan had been dead since February. Someone had written her in April. She went through the letter in her memory. The handwriting had been slightly different, she realized now. Slightly more careful. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time because people's handwriting changed with weather and mood and the quality of the pen. But someone had written to her in April in Daniel Callahan's name, telling her to come, telling her he would meet the train. She didn't know what to make of that. She filed it somewhere in the back of her mind to examine later, because right now she needed to solve the problem of the next week before she could think about anything else. She was not going to panic. She had decided that already, on the train platform, in the moment after the station agent told her. Some part of her had simply locked that door and decided that panic was not available as an option right now. She could afford to be frightened. She could not afford to be paralyzed. She was trying to remember whether she'd seen a schoolhouse in the few blocks between the station and Front Street, whether this town was large enough to need a teacher, when someone knocked on her door. She opened it expecting Mrs. Garfield. Instead, there was a child. She was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, barefoot despite the cooling evening air, wearing a dress that had been washed so many times the original color was anyone's guess. Her hair was dark and tangled, and she had the most serious face Evelyn had ever seen on a child. Not solemn, not sad, just watchful, the face of a small person who had learned early that the world required close attention. "You're the lady who came for my Uncle Daniel," the child said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn's hand tightened on the doorframe. "What's your name?" "Rose Callahan." She said it with the particular gravity of a child who has recently learned that a last name matters. "My mama told me, before she died, that if my Uncle Daniel ever brought a lady home, I should be kind to her, because he needed someone." She paused. "He didn't bring you home, but you came, so I think it's the same." Evelyn looked at this child standing barefoot in a hallway of a boarding house in New Mexico territory and felt something crack open in her chest that she didn't have a name for. "How did you know I was here?" she asked. "Mr. Patterson at the station told my papa's hired man that a lady had come asking for Uncle Daniel, and then I asked Mrs. Garfield which room." Rose delivered this without apology. "I walked from the ranch. It's not that far." "How far?" 4 miles. A pause. "Maybe 5. Evelyn stared at her. "You walked 5 miles alone?" "Papa doesn't know I left." Another pause, fractionally shorter than the first. "He's going to be angry." "Then we should probably get you home," Evelyn said. And then, before she had fully decided to say it, "Can I come with you?" She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was simply that she needed to exhaust every option before she spent money on another night at the boarding house, and that speaking to the Callahans, whoever they were, whatever remained of them, was at least an option worth investigating. She told herself it was not because a 7-year-old girl had appeared at her door in bare feet and spoken of her dead mother's instructions with the seriousness of a person reading from a contract, and that something in that had reached into her chest and rearranged something. She told herself a lot of things on the walk to the ranch. Rose did not fill the silence with chatter. She walked steadily beside Evelyn in the fading light and pointed out the places where the road turned without being asked. A particular rock formation, a dry creek bed, a fence post that leaned at an angle. She narrated their route the way a person describes territory. They know with their whole body, not just their eyes. Twice she stopped to remove a pebble from between her toes without any particular irritation, as though bare feet on a gravel road were simply conditions to be managed. "Was your father close with Daniel?" Evelyn asked, somewhere around the 2nd mile. "They were brothers," Rose said. "Papa and Uncle Daniel and Uncle Cray. Uncle Daniel was the oldest. Then Uncle Cray died in the spring. He got kicked by a horse. And then Uncle Daniel died. Now it's just Papa." She said this with the careful factuality of a child who has learned that falling apart over facts does not change them. "Papa doesn't sleep much anymore." "And your mother?" "She died when I was 4. Rosa glanced up at her. "I don't remember her very well, just her hands, and the way she smelled. Like the kitchen. A beet." "Is that strange?" "No," Evelyn said. "That's not strange at all." They walked the rest of the way, in a silence that had shifted into something else, something that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't uncomfortable either. Just the quiet of 2 people who had both recently adjusted their understanding of how the world worked. The ranch appeared at the end of a rutted track as the last of the light was going bronze. It was not what she had imagined from Daniel's letters, which had been written in the confident tones of a man describing something he had built and was proud of. The house was solid, stone foundation, wood frame, a covered porch that ran the length of the front, but everything around it had the look of deferred maintenance, the particular appearance of a place where someone has been working hard enough to keep everything from collapsing, but not quite hard enough to push it forward. A fence on the east side was missing 2 posts. The kitchen garden had gone ragged. The barn doors needed re-hinging. A man was standing on the porch. He was tall in the way that some men in that country were tall. Not performed, just structural, like the land itself had shaped him that way out of practical necessity. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with the hands and posture of someone who had been doing physical work since before he had the body for it. He was looking at his daughter with an expression that had moved through anger and arrived somewhere beyond it. "Rose," he said. One word, the entire weight of the evening in it. "Papa," she said back, with the composure of someone who had already accepted whatever was coming. He looked then at Evelyn, and she looked back at him, and there was a moment of mutual assessment that was entirely civil and entirely without warmth. He had dark eyes that were careful in the way tired eyes get when they've been careful for too long. Wyatt Callahan, he said. I apologize for whatever she told you to get you out here. She didn't tell me anything, Evelyn said. I offered to come. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Rose. Get inside. Rose went. She paused at the door and looked back at Evelyn once, and then she was gone. Miss... He waited. Hart. Evelyn Hart. Something moved across his face. You're the woman Daniel wrote to. Yes. He took his hat off and held it. She had the sense this was not a habitual gesture but a deliberate one, that he was deciding something and the hat was something to do with his hands while he decided it. I owe you an explanation, he said, and an apology. I'd settle for an explanation first. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he stepped aside and opened the door. You'd better come in. The kitchen was cleaner than the outside of the ranch had suggested, which told her something about him. There was a pot of something on the stove that smelled like venison stew, and the table had been set, 2 places she noticed, which meant he had not expected her. And Rose was already sitting in a chair in the corner with her feet tucked up under her, watching both of them with those careful, watchful eyes. Wyatt poured her coffee without asking and set it in front of her and sat down across the table. I wrote that letter, he said. The April one. The one that told you to come. She had suspected it. Hearing him say it out loud still landed hard. Why? Because Daniel had already sent the other letters, and I didn't know what to do about it. He'd been sick since January. By February, he was gone. He looked at the coffee cup in his hands. I found the letters in his desk, all of them, your letters, and I read them. He looked up, and something in his expression asked her not to condemn him for that too quickly. You wrote about teaching, about your sister's house, about being tired of being someone's charity case. A pause. You wrote honestly. Most people don't. You could have written to tell me he died. I should have. I know that. He set down the cup. I thought about it for 3 weeks, and then I sat down and wrote you instead. Told you to come anyway. He looked at her directly. That was wrong of me. I know that too. Why did you do it? He was quiet for a moment. From the corner, Rose was watching him with the intensity of a child who does not want to miss what happens next. Because Daniel was right about the ranch, he said, and he was right about Rose. She needs someone. I can't do it alone. I've been trying for a year and I'm doing it badly. He said this without self-pity, in the flat tone of a man reporting a structural problem. And because you sounded like someone who wouldn't flinch, he paused. I could be wrong about that. Evelyn looked at him across the kitchen table. She thought about the $6 in her corset. She thought about Mrs. Garfield's boarding house and the 50 cents a night. She thought about walking back into the station tomorrow morning and asking the agent about work, about whether there was a school, about whether a woman who had come to marry a dead man had any other options in a town she'd been in for less than 6 hours. I'm not going to marry you, she said. Something in his expression relaxed slightly, which she had not expected. I didn't ask you to, he said. Then what are you asking? I'm asking if you'd stay. Work the ranch. Get your feet under you. I'll pay what I can. It won't be much until we're better positioned. You'd have your own room, your own door. He looked at her steadily. I won't pretend the situation is better than it is. The ranch is behind. We owe money. There's a man named Crow who holds a note I'm not sure how to repay. It's not a comfortable position. I've never been in a comfortable position, Evelyn said. He looked at her, then he looked at Rose. Rose was watching Evelyn with an expression of such transparent, carefully contained hope that it was almost painful to look at directly. There's a room at the end of the hall, Wyatt said. It was Daniel's. I haven't changed anything in it. He paused. I suppose that should probably change now. Evelyn looked down at her coffee. She thought about 11 days on a train and 5 miles of New Mexico road in the company of a barefoot 7-year-old. She thought about how she had stood on that platform after the station agent told her and locked a door in herself and decided that panic was not available. She thought about how she had not, in that moment, seriously considered going back. I'd need to know everything, she said, about the finances, the note, all of it. I'm a school teacher, not an accountant, but I know how to read a ledger, and I know when numbers don't add up. If I'm going to help, I need to know what I'm actually helping with. Wyatt nodded once, slowly. I can do that. And Rose needs shoes. From the corner, Rose looked down at her bare feet and then back up with an expression that managed to be simultaneously dignified and sheepish. "She has shoes," Wyatt said. "She just doesn't wear them." "She walked 5 miles in the dark barefoot to a boarding house in town to fetch a stranger," Evelyn said. "That's either remarkable resourcefulness or a problem with supervision." "It's both," he said. And something in the kitchen shifted then. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the temperature of wariness dropping a fraction of a degree, enough to notice. "All right," Evelyn said. She set down her coffee cup. "I'll stay. For now. Until we figure out what's possible." She looked at him steadily. "But understand, I'm not doing this because I have nowhere else to go. I'm doing it because I think it might be worth doing." Wyatt looked at her for a moment, then he looked at his daughter. "Rose," he said, "go get Miss Hart some stew." Rose uncurled from the chair and went to the stove with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for permission to be useful. And Evelyn Hart sat at a kitchen table in New Mexico territory, her broken clasped carpet bag on the floor beside her chair, and watched a small girl ladle venison stew into a bowl with the careful pride of a person performing an act of hospitality that is also an act of hope. The stove crackled. Outside, the night had come down fully over the ranch, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the kitchen window, the land that Silas Crow had already decided was his sat quiet and waiting under a sky thick with stars. She would learn the name Silas Crow before the week was out. She would learn what he had built and how he had built it, and what he intended to do with a piece of land along a creek in the path of a railroad that would change everything about this territory. She would learn the shape of what was coming toward them all. But that was later. Right now there was coffee going cold in a cup and a bowl of stew, and a little girl watching her from across the kitchen table with her feet tucked up under her again, still barefoot, waiting to see what kind of person this stranger was going to turn out to be. Evelyn picked up her spoon. "Thank you, Rose," she said. And Rose Callahan, who had walked 5 miles in bare feet on the strength of a dead woman's instruction and a living child's conviction, allowed herself very carefully to almost smile. She stayed. That was the part nobody in Magdalena quite believed when word got around, and word always got around. A woman from Philadelphia, come to marry a dead man, had taken up residence at the Callahan Ranch. The feed store had opinions about it. The women at the dry goods counter had opinions about it. Even Reverend Adler, who generally kept his opinions to matters of doctrine, mentioned it obliquely in a way that made his wife elbow him hard enough that he didn't mention it again. Evelyn knew they were talking. She had grown up in a city large enough that gossip could at least spread itself thin over a wide population, and she had moved to a town small enough that there was nothing to dilute it. She understood the arithmetic of small communities. She did not particularly care, which was its own kind of armor. What she cared about was the ledger. Wyatt had given it to her on the third morning, sliding it across the kitchen table the way a man slides something across a table when he's ashamed of what's in it, but has run out of alternatives. It was a cloth-covered book, water-stained on the front corner, with entries going back 4 years in 3 different hands. Daniel's careful print, Wyatt's cramped and slightly slanted script, and a third she didn't recognize that turned out to be their younger brother Cray, who had apparently handled accounts with the cheerful imprecision of someone who trusted that things would work out. They had not worked out. She sat with that ledger for 2 full days. She took it to her room after supper and read it by lamplight, working backward from the present entries to the earlier ones, building a picture of the ranch the way you build a picture of a person from their letters, slowly, with attention, looking for the gap between what was stated and what was true. On the second night, she found what she had suspected on the first, the loan from Silas Crow, recorded in Cray's handwriting with the casual confidence of a man who believed a 2-year extension was the same thing as a solved problem. $412, borrowed against the east pasture as collateral, due when Crow called it. She brought the ledger back to the kitchen table on the morning of the third day and sat down across from Wyatt, who was eating toast with the focused inattention of a man who has learned not to expect good news. "Tell me about the Crow loan," she said. He looked up. "It's in the ledger." "I know what's in the ledger. I want to know what isn't." He put down the toast. "What do you mean?" "The loan terms Cray recorded are vague. The interest rate isn't specified. The repayment schedule isn't specified. What did Crow actually tell you when he made the loan?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Outside, Rose was doing something in the kitchen garden that involved a stick and possibly a competition with herself. He told Daniel it was a friendly arrangement, that he'd give us time to get back on our feet after the year we had. He paused. We lost 40 head to a disease that went through the herd in the spring of '86. And Martha, my wife, she died that fall. The medical bills. He stopped. It was a bad year. Most bad years are preceded by good ones that looked better than they were, Evelyn said, not unkindly. What collateral did Crow take? The east pasture, 40 acres along the creek. She had thought so. She had not wanted to be right about it, but she had thought so. That's the land the railroad survey came through. He looked at her. How do you know about the survey? Mrs. Garfield mentioned it. She doesn't think she said anything significant, but she did. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. Wyatt, that 40 acres is worth considerably more than $412 right now. And Silas Crow knew it was going to be worth more when he made the loan. The kitchen was very quiet. Rose's stick scraping in the garden had stopped. Wyatt sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man who has suspected something for a while and has been hoping he was wrong. He gave us 2 years, he said. Cray thought it was generous. He gave you 2 years because he needed time for the survey to confirm the route. She kept her voice level. This isn't a friendly arrangement. It's a plan. He brought his eyes back down to her. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, she said. I'm a school teacher who knows how to read a ledger, but I'd want to know exactly what that promissory note says before I was sure of anything, because the one thing Cray recorded in this book does not match what you just described to me. What do you mean? He wrote the due date as at lender's discretion. She tapped the ledger. That means Crow can call the loan whenever he chooses, not at the end of 2 years. Whenever. The look on Wyatt Callahan's face in that moment was not one she could easily describe. It moved through several things. Recognition, something like fury, something like the particular cold feeling of understanding you have been very stupid about something important, and arrived at a controlled blankness that she was beginning to recognize as his version of keeping himself together. He hasn't called it yet, Wyatt said. No, she said. He hasn't. They looked at each other across the table. He will, Wyatt said. Yes, she said. I think he will. She threw herself into the ranch the way she had always thrown herself into a new school year, with the specific energy of someone who finds structure stabilizing and chaos intolerable. She started with what she could actually fix and made herself leave alone what she couldn't, at least for now. The kitchen garden was first because it was immediate and visible, and because Rose, she discovered, genuinely wanted to learn things, any things, and the garden gave them something to do together while Evelyn taught her fractions by way of seed rows and multiplication by way of estimating yield. Rose was sharp, not just in the way that adults say children are sharp when they mean bright. She had a particular quality of attention that reminded Evelyn of the best students she'd ever had, the ones who didn't just receive information but actively rearranged it, testing it against what they already knew. She asked questions that arrived sideways that seemed to be about one thing and were actually about another. On the 4th day, while they were thinning carrot seedlings, she asked, "Did you want to come here? Before you knew Uncle Daniel was dead?" Evelyn considered lying, and then decided that a child who asked questions that direct deserved better. "Yes," she said. "I wanted to go somewhere that was mine. The place didn't matter as much as the going." Rose thought about this for a while, running a seedling between her fingers. "Mama used to say that home is the people, not the place." "Your mama sounds like she was wise." "Papa says she was stubborn." A pause. "I think they're the same thing." Evelyn looked at the top of the child's dark head and felt that crack in her chest from the boarding house doorway open another fraction of a degree. She did the accounts on Sunday mornings, when Wyatt was occupied with the horses, and Rose was ostensibly reading but actually watching a lizard on the porch. She worked out what they had, what they owed, what they could realistically earn by the end of the season if the cattle prices held, and the numbers did not add up. They came close. They came frustratingly, infuriatingly close, close enough that she could see the shape of solvency from where she was standing, like a town visible from a hilltop that was farther away than it looked. But close was not enough when the lender could call the note at discretion. She started to think about other options. She was turning this over one evening, sitting on the porch after supper, while Wyatt checked the fence line before dark, when he came back earlier than expected and dropped onto the other chair with the heaviness of someone who has learned something unpleasant. "Crow's man came by while I was at the south fence," he said. "A man named Purcell. He works for Crow." "What did he want?" "He said Crow wanted to remind me that the note could be called at any time, and that given recent developments, he was considering doing exactly that." He looked at his hands. "He said it the way you'd say good morning, like it was ordinary." Evelyn felt the cold, clean edge of anger, which was different from fear and considerably more useful. "How much time?" "He said 30 days, but that's not official. That's a courtesy." "A courtesy." She let that sit for a moment. "Wyatt, I want to go into town tomorrow. I want to talk to the bank." He looked at her. "About what?" "About whether anyone else holds notes on this land. About what the survey has actually designated along Copper Creek and how wide the easement is." The bank manager's name was Harlan Fitch, and he was the sort of man who had learned to be pleasant as a professional skill and had done it so long it had worn through to something that resembled sincerity. He was cautious with Evelyn in the way that men in that era were cautious with women who came in asking questions. Not dismissive exactly, but careful, like someone handling something that might break or might bite, and he wasn't sure which. She had anticipated this. She had dressed carefully that morning, not to impress, but to forestall a particular kind of dismissal. The good wool traveling coat over the plain dress, her hair pinned correctly, everything that said, "I am a serious person having a serious conversation, not a hysteric and not a fool." She had brought the ledger. She had brought the copy she'd made of the loan entry. She had brought a list of questions written in her neat schoolteacher's hand. "I'm trying to understand the history of loans called by Silas Crow in this county over the past 5 years," she said, once the pleasantries were concluded. "Not necessarily loans held by your institution. Any public record of foreclosure proceedings or deed transfers that originated with a Crow loan." Fitch looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at his hat. "That's," Fitch started, "that's an unusual line of inquiry, Miss Hart." "It is," she agreed. "Do you have the records?" He did have the records because the records were public, because she had done enough research the evening before in the collection of legal pamphlets she'd found in Daniel's room to know that property transfers in New Mexico territory were matters of public record, and she was entitled to see them. Fitch knew she knew this. She could see him knowing it. He brought out the records. She spent 90 minutes with them while Wyatt sat in the chair beside her with the rigid posture of a man being careful not to show how much he didn't want to know what she was finding. She made notes. She cross-referenced. She asked Fitch 2 questions that were innocent enough in isolation, but together mapped something he clearly found uncomfortable because he stopped making small talk and started watching her with an expression that had moved from caution to something closer to unease. When she was done, she thanked him, gathered her notes, and walked out. On the street outside, in the flat noon light, she told Wyatt what she'd found. 3 other ranches in the last 4 years, all of them with loans taken in a period of hardship, a drought year, a disease year, a death in the family. All of them with collateral in land that had later proved to have value the borrowers hadn't anticipated. All of them with note terms that gave Crow discretion on timing. 2 of them had transferred title to a holding company that, if you followed the name through enough registration documents, turned out to share an address with Crow's primary business office. The 3rd family had simply left. She didn't know yet what had happened to them. Wyatt stood on the sidewalk and listened to all of this without speaking. "He's been doing this for at least 4 years, she said. "Probably longer." "That doesn't help us repay the note," he said. "No," she said. "Not directly. But it means there are other people who were hurt by him, and some of them are probably still here." He looked at her. "You want to find them." "I want to talk to them," she said. "Because if we can document a pattern, if we can show that this is not an isolated dispute about one loan, but a deliberate practice of predatory lending, we have something to bring to the Territorial Land Office. Maybe not enough for criminal charges, but enough to create pressure, enough to make it cost him something to continue." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Down the street, a wagon was loading. 2 men were arguing mildly about something to do with a crate. The ordinary machinery of a small town running in ordinary daylight. "You know," he said finally, "when I wrote that letter and told you to come, I thought I needed someone to keep the accounts." "You did need someone to keep the accounts," she said. "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. His expression was difficult to read, which she was accustomed to. He wore his face like territory he wasn't inviting visitors to, most of the time, but something in it had shifted. "What do you mean?" she asked. He put his hat back on. "Come on," he said. "We should get back before Rose decides the chickens need rearranging again." "What?" She went to 3 ranches in the following 2 weeks. She went alone, which Wyatt didn't like and said so. And she went anyway, which he disliked more but accepted because he had learned in the first 2 weeks of knowing her that the particular set of Evelyn Hart's jaw when she had decided to do something was not a feature of her face that was open to negotiation. The first was the Lester family, what remained of them, which was a woman named Clara Lester, and her 2 adult sons, working a reduced acreage after losing their east quarter to a Crow foreclosure 2 years earlier. Clara Lester opened the door and looked at Evelyn for a long moment, and then said, "You're the one staying at Callahan's." "I am," Evelyn said. "Can I come in?" She could come in. She could have coffee, a significant offering, and she could listen to a story that was in its bones identical to the one she was living, just 2 years further along and already finished badly. Clara Lester was not angry anymore. She had moved past anger into a kind of flattened resignation that Evelyn found in some ways harder to look at than fury would have been. She told the story carefully, with the precision of a person who has gone over it enough times to have worn all the emotion out of the words, leaving just the shape. "I thought about fighting it," Clara said. "My boys wanted to, but we didn't have the money for a lawyer, and Crow knew that." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "He knows exactly what people can and can't afford. That's how he picks them." "Would you be willing to put what you told me in writing?" Evelyn asked. "Signed and witnessed?" Clara Lester looked at her for a long time. "What good would it do?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn said honestly. "But I think the first step is knowing what we have before we decide what to do with it." Clara thought about it. Then she called her older son in and had him witness it, and Evelyn walked back to the wagon with a signed statement folded in her coat pocket, and something that was not quite hope, but was in the same neighborhood. The second ranch was harder. The man, his name was Patterson, no relation to the station agent, had lost his property 18 months earlier and had not recovered from it in any direction. He lived in the remaining outbuildings on land that was technically no longer his, in some arrangement with the new owners that he explained badly, and she didn't press. He was in his 60s, and he had the look of a man who had stopped arguing with the shape of his own life. He talked to her for 40 minutes, and then said he wouldn't put anything in writing because he didn't see the point, and he didn't want the trouble. She thanked him and left and sat in the wagon for a moment before she picked up the reins. She had 4 signed statements by the end of the second week. 4 people who had dealt with Silas Crow, who had loans with discretionary terms, who had lost land that turned out to be worth more than anyone had said at the time of borrowing. She organized them with the loan details from the ledger and the information from the bank records, and she built, on the kitchen table over 3 evenings, while Wyatt sat across from her and Rose slept upstairs, something that looked like a case. "It's not enough for a judge," she said on the 3rd evening. "Not yet, but it might be enough for the land office, and it's definitely enough to make noise." Wyatt was reading one of the statements, Clara Lester's, which was the clearest because Clara had a specific, methodical mind and had written it in the language of someone used to keeping her own accounts. "She says he sent someone to her fence line twice before the foreclosure," he said. "To do what?" "She doesn't specify. She said, making assessments. I think he was checking the boundary of the land he wanted before he moved to foreclose." She looked at him. "Has anyone come to your fence line?" He looked up from the paper. "Purcell," he said, slowly. "Last month. Before he came to tell me about the 30 days, I thought he was delivering a message." "He was," she said, "just not the one you thought." The candle between them had burned down an inch since they'd sat down. Outside the kitchen window, the night was very dark, the kind of dark that the territory did perfectly, and that she was still adjusting to. No city light, no ambient glow, just stars and the sound of the horses in the barn shifting now and then in their sleep. "Evelyn," Wyatt said. He said her name carefully, like it was something he'd decided to do and wanted to do correctly. "What?" "I want you to know that I understand what it is you're doing." He set down Clara Lester's statement. "I know you didn't come here for this. I know this isn't what you agreed to." She looked at him across the table. He was tired, Not the simple tiredness of physical work, but the deeper kind, the kind that lives in the part of a person that's been managing grief and worry and the daily weight of a threatened thing for longer than is sustainable. She had seen it on him from the first evening and watched it change shape as the weeks passed, and she could not have said whether it was getting better or just becoming something she recognized. "What did I agree to?" she said. "Temporary," he said. "You said temporary." She looked down at the papers on the table between them. The signed statements, the loan records, the notes she'd made in her school teacher's hand. 4 weeks of work she had not been asked to do and had done anyway, because leaving it undone would have meant leaving something worth saving, and she had decided early that she was not good at leaving things worth saving. "Wyatt," she said, "I've been a school teacher for 7 years. Do you know what you learn about people when you teach children?" He shook his head slightly. "You learn that the ones worth keeping are the ones who don't flinch at hard things," she said. "Not the ones who pretend the hard things aren't hard, the ones who see it clearly and do it anyway." She straightened the papers. "This ranch is worth keeping. That little girl upstairs is worth keeping. And I don't walk away from things worth keeping just because someone decided to make it difficult." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Crow is going to push back when he finds out we've been talking to people." "I know. He's not going to like it." "I know that too. He has more resources than we do, more leverage, more—" "Wyatt." She looked at him directly. "I know all of that. I've been thinking about all of that for 2 weeks. What I keep coming back to is that the one thing he doesn't have is a woman who has already lost everything once and decided it was survivable." She paused. "He's not expecting me. That's the only advantage I have, and I intend to use it entirely." Something moved through his expression. It wasn't a smile. It was something quieter and more complicated than a smile, something that had to do with recognizing a quality in another person that you hadn't known you needed to see. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. She began gathering the papers. He picked up the candle to give her more light, and they sat like that, at the kitchen table with the candle between them and the night outside and the work spread between them, until the statements were sorted and the lamp was burning low, and it was time to go to sleep. The 30 days were not a courtesy. She had known that from the start. They were a clock, and Crow had set it running, and somewhere in his office in whatever town he operated from, he was sitting with his own set of papers and his own calculations, waiting for it to run down. What he didn't know, what she was counting on him not knowing, was that she was counting too. 2 weeks left. 14 days. She had 4 signed statements, a pattern that any reasonable person could see, and an idea forming at the back of her mind that wasn't quite a plan yet, but was getting there. She needed one more thing. She needed something that could turn a pattern of evidence into an irreversible public record before Crow could move to foreclose. She didn't know yet what that thing was. She went upstairs and opened the door of Daniel Callahan's room. Her room now, though she still thought of it with his name attached, and stood for a moment looking at the bookshelf he'd kept along the east wall. She had been going through his things gradually, not to erase him, but because the room needed to be lived in by a living person, and she was the living person who lived in it now. She hadn't finished the shelf. There were several books still stacked on the lower board that she hadn't moved, and beside them a small wooden box she had assumed contained personal letters and had been leaving alone out of a feeling she couldn't entirely justify. She looked at the box. Then she took it down from the shelf and set it on the desk and opened it. It was not personal letters. It was records. Bills of sale, survey notes, receipts, and at the back, folded and refolded until the paper had gone soft at the creases, a land claim document she didn't immediately understand. She smoothed it flat on the desk and read it carefully, and then she read it again, because the first reading had told her something she needed the second reading to confirm. Somewhere on the Callahan property, she wasn't sure exactly where yet, the coordinates were given in the survey language of a different decade, was a recorded mineral claim, filed by the elder Callahan, the father, more than 20 years ago. Not oil, not coal, silver. Whether there was any silver actually, there was a different question entirely. Old mineral claims were littered across the territory like shed snakeskins, most of them worthless, filed in the optimism of men who had heard rumors and done the paperwork before the reality caught up. But a claim was a legal document. It was a recorded asset, and an asset, even a speculative one, had a value that could be used. She sat at the desk in Daniel Callahan's room for a long time. Then she went and knocked on Wyatt's door. He answered it after a moment, still dressed, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "I found something," she said. She held up the document. "I need you to tell me if you knew about this." He looked at it. Something shifted in his face, not recognition, not entirely. More like the particular expression of a person encountering information that changes the shape of something they thought they already understood. "Where did you find that?" he said. "The box on the lower shelf. I thought it was personal." It was Daniel's. He took the document from her and held it in both hands. "I didn't know he kept this. I thought he'd thrown it out." He looked up. "This is our father's claim. He filed it before the mine survey showed the deposit was too small to be profitable. He always said it wasn't worth the paper it was written on." "It might not be," she said, "but it's a recorded legal asset, and a recorded legal asset has a dollar value in court, even a speculative one." She looked at him steadily. "Wyatt, it might be enough." He stood in the doorway of his room holding his dead father's mineral claim and looked at her, and the night was very quiet around them both, and somewhere in the dark the clock that Silas Crow had started was still running. But now at least they had something to run it against. The mineral claim needed verification before it could be used as anything, and verification meant a trip to the Territorial Land Office in Socorro, which meant 2 days of travel and leaving the ranch in the care of a hired hand named Emilio, who was reliable with horses and less reliable with anything that required sustained attention. Wyatt didn't want to. He said it was because the ranch couldn't spare him for 2 days, and that was partially true. The other part was something he didn't say, which was that leaving felt like turning his back on something that might be attacked the moment he wasn't watching it. Evelyn understood this feeling and did not argue with it directly. "Then I'll go alone," she said. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her with increasing frequency, that recalibrating look, the one where he was adjusting something and not entirely happy about what the adjustment required of him. "You can't go to the land office alone." "I've been going places alone my entire adult life," she said. "I came to New Mexico Territory alone. I walked 5 miles of desert road in the dark with your daughter." She paused. "I think I can manage a 2-day trip to Socorro." He went with her. They left Rose with Clara Lester, which was Evelyn's idea, and which Rose received with the dignified acceptance of a child who has learned that objecting to adult decisions is rarely productive, but who made her feelings known through the quality of her silence on the subject. Clara Lester, for her part, seemed to welcome the company in a way that went beyond politeness. She had been alone since her sons left for seasonal work in Las Cruces, and there was something in the way she and Rose regarded each other that first morning that suggested they might do each other some good. The land office in Socorro occupied 2 rooms on the second floor of a building that also housed a surveyor's office and, inexplicably, a dentist. The clerk was a young man named Briggs, who had the careful efficiency of someone who has learned that his job is to locate and retrieve documents, and not to have opinions about what people do with them. He found the senior Callahan mineral claim in under 20 minutes, which surprised both of them, and spread it on the counter alongside the original survey notes filed with it. Evelyn read it carefully. Wyatt stood beside her and read it over her shoulder. The claim was legitimate. Filed in 1871 by Thomas Callahan, surveyed by a licensed territorial surveyor whose seal was still clear, covering a quarter section of land on the eastern edge of the Callahan property along a secondary tributary of Copper Creek. The notation in the accompanying survey described evidence of silver-bearing quartz formations of uncertain extent and commercial viability, which was the surveyor's careful way of saying there might be something there, but he wouldn't stake money on it. "Can I get a certified copy of this?" Evelyn asked Briggs. "Yes, ma'am, $1.50. "And a certified copy of the original survey." She thought for a moment. "And any subsequent surveys of that quadrant that were filed after 1871. Briggs went looking. He came back 15 minutes later with a slightly different expression. The expression of someone who has found something unexpected and is deciding whether it's his business to have an opinion about it. He set a second survey document on the counter. It was dated 1884. It had been filed by a surveying company out of Albuquerque, and the commissioning party listed at the top was a holding company called Copper Creek Land Associates. Evelyn looked at the name. Then she looked at Wyatt. "Is that one of Crow's companies?" she asked quietly. He looked at it for a moment. "I don't know. I'd have to check." She looked at Briggs. Is there a business registration for Copper Creek Land Associates on file anywhere accessible here? Briggs thought about it. Business registrations would be in the county clerk's office. That's downstairs. She took all three documents: the original claim, the original survey, the 1884 survey, certified, paid for them, and went downstairs. The county clerk's office was staffed by a woman of around 50, with reading spectacles pushed up on her forehead and the demeanor of someone who has organized every piece of paper in her building and could locate any of them in under 3 minutes, and would be mildly insulted if you doubted this. Copper Creek Land Associates was registered in 1883. The registered agent was a man named Terrence Lyle, attorney at law. The business address was a post office box in Albuquerque. The listed directors were 3 names Evelyn didn't recognize. She wrote them all down. On the ride back to Magdalena, in the long, flat light of late afternoon, she told Wyatt what she was thinking. The 1884 survey was commissioned a year after Crow, or someone connected to him, established that land company, she said. He had your land surveyed before he made the loan to your brother. He already knew what was there. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved along the road with the particular rhythm of New Mexico roads, which varied between bad and worse in ways you couldn't predict until you were already in them. He knew about the silver. He knew about the potential for silver, or for railroad value, or both. She held the certified copies against the movement of the wagon. He surveyed it, established a land company to receive the title, and then waited for a moment of vulnerability. She paused. Your wife died in 1886. You borrowed money in early 1887. 5 months, Wyatt said. His voice was very flat. He waited 5 months. He may have been waiting for the right kind of hardship, not just financial trouble that can be worked out. He needed something that would make a man desperate enough to take an unfavorable loan without reading the terms carefully. He was quiet. I'm sorry, she said. I know that's... Don't apologize. He said it without anger. You're telling me what's true. That's more useful than being careful about it. They drove the rest of the way as the sun went down and the sky turned the colors that the New Mexico sky did at dusk, which were unreasonably beautiful in a way that still caught her off guard sometimes. The deep orange going to purple, going to a blue so dark it was almost the color of a bruise. She had stopped being surprised that she noticed these things. She was apparently a person who noticed the sky now. That was something that had happened to her in the past 6 weeks, and she had not entirely accounted for it yet. He had a habit of noting things down. Daniel used to tease him about it. Where are his things? The storage room, off the back porch. I boxed his things when he died. I haven't gone through them. A pause. I haven't wanted to. She understood that without needing it explained. When you're ready, she said. Not before. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed off the door frame. Come to bed, he said again. It'll still be there in the morning. She went. What? 8 days before Crow's 30-day courtesy period was set to expire, something woke Evelyn at 2 in the morning. She was not entirely sure what it was. She came up out of sleep with that sudden, complete alertness that the body produces when something has breached the boundary between normal and wrong. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of the usual sounds being replaced by a different one. She lay in the dark of Daniel's room for 3 seconds, listening. Then she smelled it. Smoke. Not the comfortable smoke of a banked fire. This was something else, something with a sharper edge to it, something that came with heat behind it. She was out of bed and in the hallway before she had consciously decided to move. She hit Wyatt's door with her palm hard. Fire, she said. Twice. Then she went for Rose. Rose was already awake. She had the light sleeper's quality of a child who has learned that nighttime noises mean something. And she came out of her room with her eyes wide and her feet, for once, already in her boots. The barn, she said. I know. Go to the porch. Stay there. Rose went. Evelyn went for the barn. She would not be able to explain this decision clearly, later, in the way that people expect decisions to be explainable. She would say, when asked, that she was thinking about the horses. And that was true. She would say she was thinking about whether the fire had reached the hayloft and whether there was time, and that was true too. What she would not say, because she didn't know how to say it, was that there was a quality of wrongness to the night. The fire was too contained, too deliberate in its origin point, with none of the random spreading of an accident, that told her someone had done this on purpose, and that knowledge made her angry in a way that overrode everything else. The barn doors were hot, but not impossible. She got the near horse out first, Wyatt's gray, who was terrified and fought her briefly, and then came, because even a terrified horse will follow something that moves with enough certainty. She got the second horse, the bay mare, out through the back. The third, a younger gelding that had always been skittish, had worked himself into a corner and would not move, and she was pulling at his halter with both hands, and her eyes streaming from the smoke when Wyatt's hand closed over hers, and he said, very close to her ear, "I've got him. Get out." She got out. She made it to the yard and dropped to one knee and coughed until her eyes watered and her ribs ached. The barn was burning in earnest now. The east wall had gone entirely, and the loft had caught, and the light of it was extraordinary and terrible, throwing orange shadows 40 feet into the dark around them. The horses were out. Emilio had appeared from somewhere and was holding the gray, who was still trembling. Wyatt came out of the barn's side door with the gelding, and his face was black with smoke, and he was not looking at the fire. He was looking at the ground near the east wall. She followed his look. In the firelight she could see it, the specific pattern of burn origin that she didn't have a professional name for but that her eyes understood anyway. The fire had started low and in two places simultaneously, with about 4 feet between them. Accidents start in one place. This had started in two. "Emilio," Wyatt said, "take the horses to the south pasture." His voice was very quiet. It was the quietest she had ever heard him sound. Emilio went. "Rose," Wyatt said. Rose was on the porch exactly where Evelyn had told her to be, wrapped in a blanket she'd apparently thought to grab, watching the burning barn with an expression that was trying very hard to be calm. "Stay there." "I know," Rose said. He walked to where Evelyn was standing and looked at the origin point again. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The barn crackled and shifted. A section of roof came down in a cascade of sparks that rose 20 feet and scattered in the wind. "Purcell," Evelyn said. "Or someone Crow paid," Wyatt said. "Not Purcell himself. Crow doesn't use his own hands for this kind of thing." She looked at him. His profile in the firelight was hard and still. "You sound like you knew this was coming." "I thought it might." He was quiet for a moment. "After you talked to the Lesters, after you started going around asking questions, I knew he'd push back. I just didn't know how." "You didn't tell me." "No." She absorbed that. There were several things she could have said, and she picked the one that mattered most right now. "The papers," she said. "The documents." He looked at her. "Are they still in the house?" "Yes." "Then we still have everything." She looked at the burning barn, at the 7 weeks of her life that were somehow woven into this place now. The horses she'd learned to name. The fence posts she'd watched get repaired. The morning she'd stood in the kitchen with coffee going cold while she read the ledger for the 4th time, looking for something she'd missed. "He burned the barn," she said. "Not the house. Not the animals. He wanted us to know what he could do without doing anything we could actually hold him for." "It's a warning," Wyatt said. "It's a mistake," she said. "Because now we have something documented that isn't just financial records." He looked at her. "Sheriff Alderman," she said. "In the morning. Tonight, if he'll come." She met his eyes. A deliberate fire is a crime, and a crime committed 8 days before a loan deadline is a pattern even a judge can read. Sheriff Alderman came at dawn. He was a compact, methodical man in his 50s who said little and looked at things closely and wrote things down in a small book with the precision of someone who understood that what he recorded would matter later. He examined the burn origin without being prompted. He made notes. He asked Evelyn and Wyatt both separately what they had observed, and he listened to both accounts without comment, and then he walked a slow perimeter of the burned structure and came back. "You're saying Silas Crow arranged this," he said. Not a question. More like a statement that he was laying on the table to see what happened to it. "I'm saying it's consistent with the pattern," Evelyn said. "I have documentation." Alderman looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has dealt with Silas Crow before and knows exactly how difficult that dealing is. "What kind of documentation?" "Signed statements from 3 other property owners. Land office records showing a survey commissioned by a company connected to Crow before he made predatory loans to those same owners, a loan note with discretionary terms, and now a deliberately set fire 8 days before a deadline. She paused. I'm not asking you to arrest him. I'm asking you to open an investigation that is formally on the record before that deadline passes. Alderman was quiet for a moment. You know he has a lawyer. I know he has several. I also know that lawyers are less useful when the client's pattern of behavior is on record with a territorial law enforcement officer. She looked at him steadily. Sheriff, I'm not asking you to take a side. I'm asking you to do your job. Something shifted in Alderman's expression. It was not quite a smile. You from back east? Philadelphia. Thought so. He wrote something in his book. I'll open an investigation into the fire. That's what the evidence supports right now. He looked at Wyatt. If you have documents you want officially noted, bring them to my office today. I'll log them. I'll bring them this afternoon, Evelyn said. She was in the storage room off the back porch by 9 that morning. She had not asked Wyatt. She had told him, and he had looked at the door of the storage room for a long moment, and then nodded and gone to deal with the insurance man who had appeared about the barn, because that was another problem that needed managing, and there were only 2 of them. The room was exactly what she'd expected. Boxes stacked with the particular organization of a person who categorized things instinctively, every box with a label in that third handwriting she had come to recognize as Cray Callahan's. She started with the box labeled Ranch Business, 1886 to 87, because that was the period of the loan. She went through it with the focus she brought to everything she didn't want to rush, which meant she went through it slowly. Receipts for feed and equipment, correspondence with buyers in Albuquerque. An unsigned contract draft that had been abandoned halfway through and she couldn't tell why. And near the bottom, in a leather-bound notebook about the size of her own, a journal. She sat on the floor of the storage room and opened it. Cray Callahan, it turned out, had not just kept records. He had kept a running account of everything he found suspicious, not because he thought it would be useful or because he suspected specifically what was happening, but because it was his nature. He had written down conversations he'd had with Purcell, the exact date and wording of the loan discussion, including things Daniel had told him that weren't in the formal note. 2 separate instances where Crow's people had appeared on Callahan land under various pretexts, once asking about water rights, once claiming a stray animal. Cray had written each of these down with a note at the bottom. Something about this doesn't sit right. He had also written, on a page near the back, the name of a man, a merchant in Socorro named Aldous Webb, with a notation. Webb saw Crow's man in the east pasture before Daniel signed the note. Can document. And then, in a different ink, clearly added later, Webb is willing to swear to it if needed. Danny says don't stir things up. I don't agree. Evelyn sat on the floor of the storage room and read this 4 times. She had not expected this. She had been hoping for something and had prepared herself for finding nothing, and what she had found was something considerably better than nothing. A dead man's careful, stubborn record of exactly what she needed. A pattern of behavior documented by an eyewitness before it became relevant. A witness willing to swear to it. She carried the journal into the kitchen and set it on the table. Then she stood over it for a moment with her hands flat on either side of it, and she thought about Cray Callahan, a man she had never met, who had died from a horse kick in the spring of a bad year, who had written things down because things didn't sit right, and who had argued with his brother about whether to stir them up. She thought about the particular stubbornness of people who notice things and write them down even when no one asks them to, even when the information feels like it might not matter, even when the people around them say to let it go. It mattered. He had been right, and it mattered, and he would never know. She pressed her hands flat on the table for a moment. Then she straightened and picked up the journal and went to find Wyatt. I was on the porch with the insurance man, who was explaining in the careful language of insurance men that the barn coverage would pay for partial reconstruction, but not for certain elements that he specified with the elaborate vagueness of someone who has learned to be technically accurate and practically unhelpful. Wyatt was listening with the expression of a man who is following every word and finding each one more dismal than the last. She waited until the insurance man left. Then she handed Wyatt the journal. He took it and looked at the cover. She watched something move across his face when he recognized the handwriting. A quick, involuntary thing, there and gone. The kind of expression people make when they've been managing grief carefully, and something slips through the management. "Where did you find this?" he said. "The storage room, the box labeled ranch business." She paused. "Read the last 15 pages. He sat down on the porch step and read. She stood and waited because there was nothing useful she could do except give him the time it required. A hawk was working the thermals above the east pasture, making long, slow circles over the ground where the grass was browning in the heat. From somewhere in the house, she could hear Rose moving around, probably attempting to make the lunch she had announced that morning she was going to make, which Evelyn had agreed to because Rose's determination was the kind of thing you only impeded if you had a better reason than inconvenience. Wyatt looked up from the journal. His face had gone through several things and arrived at something she didn't have a clean word for. "Webb is still in Socorro," he said. "I know. We can send a letter today, or go ourselves if there's time." She paused. "Wyatt, this is what we needed. This is the piece I didn't know how to find." He looked down at the journal again. He was running his thumb along the edge of the pages, not turning them, just feeling the paper. "He told me to let it go," he said. "About Crow. After the loan was signed. I thought Cray was being paranoid. He wasn't. No." He set the journal carefully on the porch step beside him, the way you set something down when you want to make sure it doesn't fall. "He was right, and Danny and I both told him to drop it, and he wrote it all down anyway because he thought it mattered." A pause. "That's Cray." The hawk circled lower over the east pasture and then caught a thermal and rose again. The morning had the dry, specific heat of the high desert, the kind of heat that settles into surfaces and radiates back at you from two directions simultaneously. She sat down on the porch step beside him. Not close, 2 feet of space between them, but alongside, which was different from across a table. "He was right," she said, "and it's going to matter. If Webb will swear to it. He told Cray he would, and the fire last night. That changes things. Crow has already escalated beyond financial pressure. That's a more serious exposure for him than he probably planned for." She paused. "I think he panicked. I think he found out we'd been talking to people and he panicked, and the fire was a panic move." Wyatt looked at her. "Men like Crow don't panic. Every man panics when his plan stops working the way he expected it to." She met his eyes. "He expected you to be alone. He expected no one to look at the pattern. He expected fear to do the work that evidence wasn't doing." She paused. "He's been doing this for 4 years with nobody fighting back. He doesn't know how to adjust for someone fighting back." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the journal and held it with both hands, the way he'd held his dead father's mineral claim the night she'd brought it to him in the hallway. Both hands, carefully, as though the thing itself required that. 8 days, he said. 7, now, she said. "We need to send word to Webb today. We need to get back to the sheriff with the journal. And we need to figure out exactly what the mining claim is worth as a leverage point, because I've been—" "The claim," she said. "Even if the silver deposit is too small to be profitable, someone needs to formally assess it. And a formal assessment takes time. And while a formal assessment of a registered asset is in progress, there's an argument that the asset's value is undetermined, which means the collateral situation on the note is complicated." She paused. "It might not hold up, but it creates enough uncertainty to slow him down. And if we can slow him down long enough to get the repayment together—" "We don't have $400, he said. "Not yet." She had been thinking about this since the fire. Since the moment she had stood in the yard watching the barn burn and done the arithmetic the way she always did when she was frightened, methodically, starting with what she actually knew. The community-wide, Clara Lester, the other ranchers who've dealt with Crow, the people in town who understand what a Crow takeover of that land means for all of them. She looked at him steadily. "We are not the only people in this territory with a reason to stop him. We are just the people who currently have the documents and the deadline." He looked at the burned barn. Its skeleton was still standing. The stone foundation, 2 upright support posts, the ghost of the structure that had been there yesterday morning. In the morning light, it was less dramatic than it had been at 2 in the morning, and considerably more sad. "You want to ask people for money," he said. "I want to give people the opportunity to protect their own interests," she said. "Which is different." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but close. "All right," he said. He stood up, the journal in his hand. "Let's go talk to Alderman." She stood too. She looked at the burned barn one more time and thought about the man who had paid someone to light those 2 points of fire in the early morning dark, sitting somewhere in his comfortable office, expecting fear to travel back to him like a message. She thought about what it would be like to be that man and discover that the message hadn't arrived. Then she went inside to get the documents, and the day, which had already been going since before dawn, kept going. The wind off the desert moved through the yard and pushed the smell of ash eastward, and the hawk over the pasture made one more long circle and then arrowed off toward the tree line and was gone. 7 days. 7 days felt like a different kind of time than the weeks that had preceded it. The earlier weeks had moved with the texture of sustained effort, slow, sometimes grinding, but with the momentum of things being built. These 7 days had the quality of a held breath. Everything was in motion, but the motion felt suspended, like watching a stone at the top of its arc before gravity remembered what it was supposed to do. Evelyn slept 4 hours the first night and did not waste energy feeling sorry about it. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark before dawn and worked through the numbers again. Not because they had changed, but because working through numbers was the thing her mind did when it needed to feel like it was doing something useful. $412. The certified assessment of the mineral claim, which a territorial surveyor named Greer had agreed to begin immediately for a fee of $30 she didn't yet have, would take at minimum 5 days. She had sent word to Aldous Webb in Socorro the same afternoon she'd found Cray's journal, by way of a writer named Torres who did courier work between towns and who Emilio had recommended with the endorsement that Torres was fast and didn't lose things. She had not yet heard back from Webb. She had $6 left in the purse sewn into her corset. The ranch accounts had $11 in the operating fund after paying Emilio's wages. Combined with the partial insurance payout on the barn, which Harlan Fitch at the bank had confirmed would be released within 48 hours, they had a total of $63. 63 against 412. With 7 days left on a clock, a man named Silas Crow had started running because he had calculated, with the cold precision of someone who had done this successfully 4 times already, that no one would be able to stop it. She wrote down the number, 349. What remained? What she needed to find in 7 days from people who did not have excess money to give, in a territory that ran on hard seasons and thin margins, and the particular kind of stubborn optimism that kept people out here in the first place. She was still looking at that number when Wyatt came downstairs at 5:30. He looked at the table, at the papers, at her, and went and poured himself coffee without being asked to, which was something he had started doing sometime in the past 3 weeks without either of them noting the change. "How bad?" he said. "349 short." He sat down. He drank his coffee. She watched him do the same arithmetic she had already done and arrive at the same place. "It's not possible," he said. "Not with defeat, just as a factual statement, the way you note that a fence post is rotten through." "I don't know that yet," she said. He looked at her. "Evelyn, where does $349 come from in 7 days?" "From people who have reason to care whether Crow wins this one." She had been building this argument in her head since the night of the fire, turning it like a stone to look at all its surfaces. "Wyatt, think about what happens if he takes this ranch. He has the railroad easement land. He has the silver claim. He has a demonstrated pattern of predatory acquisition that has now gone public. Alderman's investigation means it's on record. If he succeeds here, in spite of everything that's now documented, he becomes untouchable. Every rancher in this county knows it. Every small operator understands what that means for their own position. Knowing it and giving money are different things." "Yes," she said, "but I'm not asking for charity. I'm proposing a specific arrangement." She slid a piece of paper across the table. She had written it up before he came downstairs, in the clean, precise hand of someone who had spent 7 years writing things on boards for children to copy. "Investors. Partial stakes in the mining claim assessment. If the silver proves out, they share in the returns proportional to what they contributed. If it doesn't prove out, they funded a documented community legal challenge to a predatory operator, and that has its own value." He read it. She watched him read it the way she always watched him read things. He was thorough, which she respected, and he did not skim, which meant he would find the weaknesses if there were weaknesses, and she needed to know what he found. "The mining claim might be worthless," he said. "It might be. You're asking people to invest in something that might be worthless." I'm asking people to invest in stopping something that is certainly harmful, she said. The claim is the incentive. The real investment is in the precedent. She paused. And I need you to understand something, Wyatt. The people I'm going to ask, they already know what Crow is. Clara Lester knows. The others know. What they haven't had before is a moment where fighting back was possible, where the documents existed and the investigation was opened and the case was buildable. She met his eyes. This is that moment, but only if we can get to the repayment deadline. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was just beginning to lighten with the first gray suggestion of dawn, the way mornings came in the desert. Not all at once, but in increments, the darkness thinning rather than breaking. Who do you start with? He said. Clara Lester, she said. She's already documented. She understands the pattern better than anyone because she lived through the end of it. And she has 2 sons who have been angry about what happened to their family for 2 years and haven't had anything useful to do with that anger. He nodded slowly. And after Clara? Harlan Fitch. He looked up. The banker. Fitch has watched Crow operate in this county for 4 years. He's seen the transfers, the note structures, the foreclosures. He's processed them. He knows exactly what they are, and he's had no reason to say so publicly because there was no public record to say it against. She paused. Now there is. And a banker who gets ahead of a predatory lending scandal rather than being caught behind it has made a wise professional decision. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. You've been planning this since the fire. I've been planning it since I found Cray's journal, she said. The fire just made it more urgent. He put down his coffee cup. All right, he said. I'll go with you to Clara's. After that, you handle Fitch alone. You're better at that kind of conversation than I am. It was the first time he had said that. The first time he had acknowledged directly that there were things she was better at, said it without the careful qualification of a man who finds the acknowledgement slightly uncomfortable. She noticed it without making anything of it, which was the appropriate response. Go wake Rose, she said. She's coming with us to Clara's. Why? Because Clara Lester is lonely, and Rose Callahan is the most effective argument for why families should be able to stay on their land that I have ever encountered. He almost laughed at that. It came out as a short exhale through his nose, which for Wyatt Callahan was in the neighborhood of a laugh. Clara Lester listened to the full proposal over coffee at her kitchen table, with Rose sitting beside Evelyn and eating a biscuit with the focused appreciation of a child who has already decided she likes this woman's cooking and wants to be invited back. Clara's older son, Ned, stood in the doorway through most of it with his arms folded. Not hostile, just the posture of someone who has been disappointed by enough plans to require the physical option of leaving to remain available. When Evelyn finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. How much are you asking from us? She said. Whatever you can spare without hardship, Evelyn said. $20 would be meaningful. 50 would be significant. I'm not going to tell you a number, and I'm not going to pressure you. The claim might be worthless, Ned said from the doorway. It might be, Evelyn said. She looked at him directly. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The incentive I'm offering is real but uncertain. What's certain is that if Crow takes the Callahan Ranch, he has the railroad land and a documented pattern that nobody stopped and a territorial legal record showing that predatory acquisition works in this county. And in 3 years or 5 years or whenever the next hardship comes, it'll be someone else at this table having this conversation. She paused. Maybe you. Ned looked at the floor. Clara looked at her hands. $40, Clara said. I have $40 in the household account that isn't committed to anything before the end of the season. Clara, Ned said, it's my $40, Nathaniel. She looked at him with the particular serenity of a woman who has been making her own decisions long enough that she no longer needs the argument to be over before she acts. Write it up, she told Evelyn. I'll sign. Ned pushed off the door frame and walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. If you're writing something for her to sign, he said, then I want to sign something too. He looked at Evelyn. I have $32. It's wages from the Las Cruces work. I was saving it for a piece of equipment. He paused. Crow has had enough of my family's money. I don't see why I shouldn't try to get some of it back. Evelyn wrote out 2 investment agreements in her careful hand, witnessed them with Wyatt's signature, and left the Lester Ranch an hour later with $72 and the particular lightness of a first real step. 349 had become 277. Harlan Fitch was careful. She had expected him to be careful. Careful was his professional and personal default, the orientation of a man who had built a stable institution in unstable territory by being the least reckless person in every room. He listened to her across his desk with his hands folded and his expression neutral in the way of bank managers, which meant that his expression was actually doing quite a lot that was not immediately readable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to invest in a mining claim assessment," he said. "I'm giving you the opportunity," she said. "I'm not asking you to commit to anything right now. I'm telling you what's happening and why and what the timeline is, because you've been the financial institution processing Crow's land transactions in this county. And within the next 10 days, one of two things is going to happen. Either Crow successfully forecloses on the Callahan Ranch and adds it to a portfolio that is now under formal investigation by Sheriff Alderman, or the foreclosure is prevented through legitimate repayment, and Crow's pattern becomes a matter of sustained public record that will affect how business is conducted in this territory going forward." Fitch looked at her for a moment. "You're saying my institution's association with Crow's transactions becomes a liability?" "I'm saying that institutions which are seen to have facilitated a pattern of predatory lending, even passively, tend to have difficult years when that pattern comes to light." She paused. "I'm not accusing your institution of anything. I'm describing a situation that is developing with or without your participation." He unfolded his hands and looked at his desk for a moment. Outside his window, Magdalena was doing its ordinary midday business. Horses at the rail, a delivery wagon blocking the corner, two women talking outside the mercantile. The ordinary machinery of a small town that did not yet know it was $277 and 6 days from a fork in its own road. "The mining claim," Fitch said. "What's the surveyor's preliminary read?" "Greer started the assessment yesterday. He said he'd have a preliminary analysis in 4 days. 4 days. He thought about this. "If the preliminary is promising, that changes the calculus." "It does," she said. "But I can't wait for the preliminary. The deadline is in 6 days and I need the repayment assembled before then." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Hart, what happens if the assessment comes back negative and I've put money into this?" "You've put money into a documented challenge to a predatory operator, and you've made a professional decision that distances your institution from an association that was becoming uncomfortable." She met his eyes. "It's not a loss. It's a cost of doing the right thing. Those are different." Something moved through his expression. He looked at his hands again, then back at her. $100, he said. "Personal funds, not institutional, at the investment terms you described." She kept her face neutral. "I'll draw up the agreement. And Miss Hart," he stopped her as she was reaching for her notebook. "Crow has an account with this bank. I cannot speak to the details. But I can tell you that a man who is drawing down significant cash reserves within a short time window is a man who expects to be making a large payment or a large acquisition very soon." He paused, with the care of a man who is telling you something without quite saying it. "That's all I'll say on the subject." She understood him completely. Crow was moving money, which meant he was preparing us either to foreclose and transfer or to respond to something he'd anticipated. Either way, the timeline was tighter than she'd thought, and the pressure he was applying was more deliberate than even she had assumed. She thanked Fitch, drew up the agreement, had him sign it, and walked out of the bank into the flat afternoon sun with $100 in documented investment commitments and a colder, cleaner understanding of what they were actually dealing with. The next 4 days moved with the specific intensity of a thing that is almost in reach and receding simultaneously. She visited 7 more people. She wrote 7 more agreements. She was refused twice, once politely, once not, and she accepted both refusals without argument because pressure was the wrong tool for this, and she knew it. People gave what they gave because they understood why, and understanding was the only foundation worth building on. By the evening of the 5th day, with 2 days remaining, she had assembled $319, $30 short. She sat on the porch in the cooling evening and looked at the number in her notebook and felt, for the first time since the night of the fire, the specific quality of being genuinely stuck. $30 was not an impossible number. It was also not a number she currently had a source for. Wyatt sat down on the porch step beside her. Not across from her, beside her, the way he'd done the morning after she'd found Cray's journal. He had stopped sitting across from her somewhere in the past 2 weeks, and she had noticed without examining it. "How short?" he said. 30. He was quiet for a moment. "I have a watch," he said. "My father's. Gold case. I've had an offer for it before, $20, from the jeweler in Socorro." "That's your father's watch, Wyatt." "I know what it is." He said it without sharpness. $20 is $20. We'd still be 10 short. She looked at her notebook. "Webb wrote back this morning," she said. She had been carrying the letter in her coat pocket all day and had not found the right moment to talk about it. "He'll come. He'll swear to what he saw. Crow's man on your land before the loan was signed, conducting what Webb described as a survey assessment. He'll be here in 2 days." "That's the deadline day," Wyatt said. "I know. It'll be close." She paused. "Having Webb present when we make the repayment matters. Having him there with a sworn statement that Crow's agent trespassed on this land before the loan was offered in front of witnesses changes the public nature of what happens." Wyatt nodded slowly. He was looking at the east pasture, where the grass was coming in thinner than it should have been because of the dry spring. The burned barn skeleton was visible at the edge of the property, and she had been carefully not looking at it since the insurance man left, and she noticed that Wyatt had developed the same habit. "My brother's horse," he said. She looked at him. "Cray's horse. A good quarter horse, 7 years old, sound. I've had an offer from the Morales family in the past. $40, maybe." He paused. "I kept her because she was his, but—" He stopped. She did not say anything. She understood that he was working through something that required him to arrive at it himself. "Cray wrote all that down," Wyatt said. "He kept that journal because he thought it mattered, and because he was right that it mattered. He'd have sold the horse himself if he'd known it would help." A pause. "I think he'd have sold it." "I think he would have too," she said. He stood up. "I'll ride to the Morales place in the morning." The Morales offer was $35, not $40. Jorge Morales was a careful negotiator and the horse market was soft. And Wyatt took it without argument because 35 was what it was and the alternative was nothing. Added to the watch, sold the following morning in Socorro for $18 because the jeweler had reduced his offer, and Wyatt accepted without the haggling he might otherwise have done. They had a total of $409, 3 short. She found the last 3 in her own coat pocket, in a compartment she had not opened since Philadelphia. A small fold of bills she had put there as emergency money and forgotten about in the compressed urgency of the past weeks, $2 bills and a folded one that had gone soft with age. She smoothed them flat on the kitchen table the evening before the deadline. $412. Wyatt looked at it from across the table. Rose was upstairs. The house was very quiet. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. He looked at the money for a long moment. She had put it in a stack in the middle of the table. The investment agreements converted to cash through Fitch's bank, the proceeds from the watch and the horse, her own $3 on top. It was not a large stack. $400 in practical currency takes up less space than you expect. "Tomorrow," he said. "At 10 o'clock, she said, "at Alderman's office, with Webb present and Alderman present and Fitch present and as many of the people who signed agreements as can come." She paused. "Crow needs to accept this repayment in public, with witnesses, with the investigation on record and Webb's statement on record. Making it private gives him room to maneuver afterward. Making it public means it's done." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "He won't come himself." "He'll send Purcell," she said, "or his lawyer. It doesn't matter. The representative accepts on his behalf and it's legally binding." "He's going to be angry." "Good," she said. "Angry men make mistakes. He's made several already. I'd like him to make a few more while there are witnesses." He looked at her across the $412. The candle between them was burning straight. No draft tonight. The air outside had gone completely still, the way it sometimes did before the weather changed. "Evelyn," he said. He said her name the way he had been saying it lately. Not carefully, the way he'd done in the beginning, but with the ease of something that had become natural without a specific moment of becoming. "What?" "When this is over," he said. He stopped, tried again. "When this is finished, I want you to know that what you've done here isn't something I had a word for when you arrived." He paused. "I'm not sure I have a word for it now, but I want you to know I know it." She looked at him across the table. 7 weeks ago, she had sat in a boarding house room in this town with $6.40 and nowhere to return to. And the most honest thing she could have told you about her own future was that she had no idea what it contained. She had not expected this ranch. She had not expected this child. She had not expected the particular quality of this man's silences, or the way he looked at things he was trying to understand with the same focused care he gave to everything, or the way he had started sitting beside her instead of across from her without either of them acknowledging the change. "I know you know it," she said. "That's enough for tonight." He nodded. He did not push it further, which was the right instinct, and she was glad he had it. Aldous Webb arrived on the morning stage at 8:15, a compact man in his 60s with the sunburned forearms of someone who spent his working life on loading docks, and the careful eyes of someone who had been a witness to things and had been waiting a long time to say so in an official capacity. He shook Evelyn's hand at the stage depot with both of his and said, "I should have come forward 2 years ago. I'm glad you found that journal." Sheriff Alderman's office at 10 o'clock held more people than it was designed for. Evelyn had not planned it as a gathering. She had simply told people what time and place, and they had come. Clara Lester was there, with both her sons. Harlan Fitch stood near the window, with his hands folded in the professional manner that was his default. 4 other ranchers from the county, 3 of whom she had spoken to, and 1 she hadn't. A man named Broussard who had heard through the network that something was happening and had driven 6 miles to be present without being asked. Alderman stood behind his desk with the specific posture of someone who understands that this is a significant moment and intends to conduct it correctly. Crow's representative was a lawyer named Ashford, young, well-dressed, with the composed expression of someone who has been told this is a routine collection matter and has not yet discovered otherwise. He arrived at 2 minutes past 10, looked at the room, and reassessed his expression. Evelyn stood at the center of the room with the money, converted to a bank draft through Fitch the previous afternoon, cleaner and more formal than cash, and waited for Ashford to introduce himself. "Miss Hart," he said, "I represent Mr. Crow's interests in the matter of the Callahan note." "I know," she said. "I'm prepared to make full repayment of the note, principal, and any applicable interest in the amount of $412 in the form of a certified bank draft. I'd like Sheriff Alderman to witness the transfer and provide a receipt." Ashford looked at the bank draft she held. He looked at the room. Something was recalibrating behind his professional composure. Yes, that satisfies the note." "I want that in writing," she said. "Signed by you as Crow's legal representative, witnessed by the sheriff, with the note marked paid in full and returned." She paused. "And I want to be clear that this repayment is being made in the presence of these witnesses, who have been informed of the full circumstances of this loan, including the predatory terms, the trespass of Crow's agent on this property prior to the loan's origination, and the deliberate arson of the Callahan barn 8 days ago." Ashford went very still. "None of that," he said carefully, "has been proven." "No," she said. "It's been documented, which is different, as I'm sure you know." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Webb." Webb stepped forward. He was holding a sworn statement, witnessed the previous evening by Alderman, describing what he had seen in the east pasture of the Callahan property in the spring of 1887. A man working with surveying equipment on land he had no right to be on, equipment consistent with a mineral and property assessment, 7 weeks before Silas Crow offered the Callahan brothers a loan against that same parcel. Webb put the statement on Alderman's desk with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has been waiting to do this for 2 years. "I'll also be submitting," Evelyn said, "a summary of the sheriff's ongoing investigation into the fire, along with copies of the signed statements from 4 other property owners who experienced loan arrangements with discretionary terms and subsequent pressure from Crow's organization to the Territorial Land Office and to the District Attorney's Office in Albuquerque." She paused. "Not today, but soon. Mr. Ashford, I'd encourage you to advise your client that the resolution of this note does not resolve the broader record that has been assembled." Ashford looked at her. He looked at the room. He looked at Alderman, who looked back with the expression of a man who is witnessing something and intends to remember it accurately. "I'll need a moment," Ashford said. "Of course," she said. He stepped outside. Through the window she could see him standing on the sidewalk with his hat in his hands, and she understood that he was either consulting some internal authority or, more likely, calculating what advising Crow to accept this outcome would cost him professionally versus what fighting it would cost him in a room full of witnesses with a sheriff and a documented arson investigation. He was a smart man, she thought, smart enough to understand that some fights are better settled. He came back inside in 4 minutes. "Mr. Crow accepts full repayment," he said. "I'll sign the receipt." The room let out a breath it had been holding. Not loudly. These were not people who celebrated before things were finished, but she felt it, the collective release of a tension that had been built for weeks. Clara Lester's older son put his hand briefly on his mother's shoulder. Fitch uncrossed his arms. Broussard, whom she still hadn't met, said something quietly to the man beside him. Alderman witnessed the transfer, provided the receipt, marked the note paid in full, and stamped it with the official seal of his office. He handed the marked note to Wyatt, who was standing beside Evelyn with the particular stillness of someone who has been braced for impact and is now slowly, carefully, standing down. Wyatt looked at the marked note for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Ashford left quickly. She didn't blame him. She stood in Alderman's office while people moved around her. Handshakes, brief conversations, the practical logistics of a community that had done something together and was now dispersing back into its separate lives. Clara Lester hugged her, briefly and firmly, in the way of a woman who has decided that a particular formality is no longer necessary. Webb shook her hand again and said he'd be in town for 2 more days if anyone needed a signed statement in a different format. Fitch nodded at her in a way that communicated both professional respect and personal relief, which was probably the most expressive she would ever see him. Broussard turned out to be a French-Canadian rancher from the north end of the county whose wife had driven to the gathering because she wanted to see the woman who had organized it, and his wife, a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Marguerite, looked Evelyn over and said, "You're smaller than I expected," which Evelyn took as a compliment. Eventually the room emptied down to Evelyn and Wyatt and Alderman and Rose, who had been standing in the corner with her boots on and her arms folded in unconscious imitation of Ned Lester, watching everything. "The investigation stays open," Alderman said. "I want you to know that. The arson investigation doesn't close because the note is paid, and the pattern documentation you submitted is going to Albuquerque, whether or not Crow pushes back on it." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Don't thank me. You built the case." He picked up his hat. "I'll tell you something. I've watched Crow operate in this county for 6 years. Nobody fought back because nobody thought they had the tools." He paused. "You found the tools." He left. His boot steps went down the hallway, and then the outer door opened and closed. The office was very quiet. Outside, Magdalena was resuming its ordinary afternoon. A dog was barking somewhere on the east end of town. A wagon went by on the street. The flat, dry New Mexico light came through the window and lay across the floor in the shape of the frame. Rose walked across the room and stood beside Evelyn and put her hand in hers, without prelude, without comment, simply as a fact of the world. She was wearing her boots. Evelyn looked down at her. Rose looked back with those watchful, serious eyes. "Is it over?" Rose said. "The note is over," Evelyn said. "The rest takes longer." "How much longer?" "I don't know exactly." She paused. "But we're still here. That's what matters right now." Rose considered this. "I knew you weren't going to leave," she said. "How did you know that?" "Because you walked 5 miles in the dark to come here the first night," Rose said. "People who are going to leave don't do that." Wyatt, standing behind them both, made the short exhale through his nose that was his version of a laugh. Evelyn felt it more than she heard it. She did not let go of Rose's hand. Later, riding back to the ranch in the wagon, with the afternoon light going long and golden over the desert, and Rose asleep between them with her head against Evelyn's arm, Wyatt said, "Crow's going to be quiet for a while. He won't go away. But he's going to be quiet." "I know," she said. "The barn needs rebuilding." "I know that too. It's going to take time. Money we don't have yet." He was looking at the road ahead. "The ranch is going to be a project for a while. It's not going to be easy." "Wyatt," she said, "when has it been easy?" He thought about that for a moment. "Fair point," he said. Rose shifted against her arm, still asleep, and Evelyn adjusted her position without thinking about it. just the automatic, ordinary adjustment of someone who has been doing this long enough that it has stopped being a decision and started being a habit. She felt the weight of the child against her side and the particular warmth of late afternoon desert light on her face and the matched rhythm of the wagon moving over the road she had walked, barefoot by proxy, on the first night of all this. She was not comfortable. The seat was hard, her back ached from a week of insufficient sleep, and the $3 she had found in her coat pocket represented the entirety of what she personally owned in the world. The ranch ahead of them was a building project, and a financial recovery and a legal situation that wasn't finished, and an east wall of a burned barn that still needed tearing down before anything could be put back up. She was aware of all of this with perfect clarity. She was also, and she noted this with the same methodical honesty she brought to ledgers, not going anywhere. The wagon moved along the road in the long, late light, and the territory opened around them, enormous, indifferent, magnificent, in the particular way of places that don't care whether you survive them. And Wyatt Callahan drove the horses home with his daughter asleep between them, and did not say anything else, and did not need to. The barn went up in 3 weeks. That was not how Evelyn had expected it to happen. She had expected it to be slow. A month, 6 weeks. The gradual accumulation of labor and material that a ranch operating on thin margins could realistically sustain. She had drawn up a reconstruction timeline on the 4th morning after the repayment, sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook and the insurance payout figures, working out what they could do and when. It was a reasonable plan. It accounted for what they had and what they lacked, and the distance between those two things. What it did not account for was the Saturday morning 3 days later when Broussard showed up at the ranch gate with his 2 hired men in a wagon loaded with lumber. Wyatt came out of the house and stood on the porch and looked at the wagon. "What's this?" he said. "Lumber," Broussard said, in the direct way of a man who finds most questions answerable with facts. "From the mill in Socorro. I get a better rate than you do." "I didn't ask for lumber." "No," Broussard said. "You didn't ask for anything. That's the problem with you, Callahan. You don't ask." He climbed down from the wagon with the deliberate movements of a man in his 50s who has stopped pretending his knees are what they were. "My wife says we're coming to help build your barn. I have learned, in 31 years of marriage, that when Marguerite says a thing is happening, the thing happens. So, here we are." Evelyn, standing in the doorway behind Wyatt, pressed her lips together to keep the expression off her face. The Lesters arrived an hour later. Clara and both sons, Ned with his sleeves already rolled. The Morales family came after noon, Jorge and his eldest and a cousin whose name Evelyn didn't catch. By the end of the first day, there were 11 people working on the Callahan Ranch, and by the end of the first week, the stone foundation had been cleared and the new posts were set, and by the end of the 3rd week, there was a barn standing where the burned one had been. Not identical, because Ned Lester had opinions about bracing and Wyatt had opinions about door width, and they had argued about both with the productive friction of people who both know what they're doing. But solid. Better than solid. On the last day, Marguerite Broussard brought a pot of soup that fed everyone, and then some. And they ate in the yard in the long afternoon light, 14 people on upturned crates and wagon boards and one actual chair that someone had dragged from somewhere. And the conversation moved the way conversation moves when people have been working together toward a shared thing, and the thing is now done. Loosely, easily, with the particular warmth of shared exhaustion. Rose ate 2 bowls of soup and fell asleep sitting upright against Evelyn's arm, which was becoming a habit that neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them was inclined to stop. Evelyn looked at the barn. It was not the barn that had burned. It was something else, newer, slightly better arranged, built by more hands than the original had been. There was something in that she couldn't have articulated precisely, but felt clearly, that the things people build together after loss are sometimes better than what was there before, not because loss is good, but because the response to it can be. This was not a comfortable thought. It required acknowledging that the fire had happened, that the threat had been real, that the year had cost this family something that couldn't be fully recovered. Wyatt's brothers were still dead. His wife was still gone. The silver claim had come back from Greer's assessment as minimal, technically present, commercially marginal, worth perhaps $40 in extraction costs against $20 in yield, which meant it had served its purpose as a legal instrument and very little else. They had repaid Crow's note with money borrowed from people who believed in a cause. and those people deserved returns that the mining claim was not going to provide. This was the problem she was working on a week after the barn was finished, sitting at the kitchen table with the investment agreement spread in front of her and the ledger open to the current accounts. The ranch was solvent, barely, carefully, with no margin for a bad season. The investors had been told honestly that the claim hadn't proved out. She owed them something for their faith, and the question was what she could actually offer. She was still working on this when Wyatt came in from the evening feeding and sat down across from her and looked at the papers. "The claim," he said. "The claim." She looked at the assessment report. $20 of extractable silver against 40 in costs. It's not nothing, but it's not what they deserve to get for their faith. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "The east pasture." She looked at him. "The railroad easement runs along the southern edge," he said. "The rest of the pasture, the part they don't need for the right-of-way. I've been thinking about what it's worth for grazing lease. If we lease it seasonally to operations that are moving cattle through, we get income without losing the land." He paused. "It's not a silver strike, but it's consistent. It's real." He looked at her. "We could structure the investor returns around lease income, over 2 years, 3 years. It's slower than they expected, but it's honest." She looked at him. He had been thinking about this, she could tell. Not just tonight, but for days. In the particular way he thought about things that mattered to him, which was quietly and thoroughly and without announcing it until he had something worth saying. "That could work," she said. "I think it could. We'd need to formalize the lease agreements, make sure the railroad easement boundaries are documented correctly so there's no overlap. I know. And we'd need to talk to each of the investors individually, explain what happened with the claim and what we're offering instead, not by letter, in person." "I know that too." He paused. "I was thinking we could start with Clara." She looked at him for a moment. The lamp between them was burning with the steady, quiet light of an evening that had no emergency in it, which was still new enough that she noticed it. The kitchen smelled like the coffee that had gone cold in her cup 20 minutes ago, and the cedar of the new barn wood that seemed to have worked its way into everything within a quarter mile. "When did you start thinking this way about the ranch?" she said. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Lease income, diversified revenue, thinking about what the land can do beyond cattle." She paused. "Daniel's letters were about cattle. The ledger before I arrived was all cattle. You're talking about something different." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been watching you think about it differently," he said. I don't know. It changes what you see when you look at the same thing." She looked at the table between them. The investment agreements, the ledger, the assessment report. The marked and paid note from Crow's loan, which she had kept because it was a document that should be kept. All the paper evidence of 2 months of sustained effort spread across the same kitchen table where she had first sat and eaten venison stew and tried to determine whether she was making a catastrophic mistake. She did not think it had been a catastrophic mistake. She thought it had been the correct decision made for imperfect reasons by a woman who was frightened and trying not to show it, which was the way most correct decisions got made. "Wyatt," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You don't know what I was going to say." "No," he admitted. "But I know what I want to say, and I've been trying to find the right time for it for about 3 weeks, and I'm starting to think there isn't a right time. There's just the time you have." He looked at her directly, in the way he had of looking at things he was trying to understand completely before he spoke. "I'm not going to dress it up. You know me well enough to know I'm bad at dressing things up." "You're not bad at it," she said. "You just don't do it unless it's necessary." "It's not necessary now," he said. "What's necessary now is saying clearly that I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Not because Rose needs you, though she does, and I'm not going to pretend that either." He paused. "Because I want you here. Because this place is different with you in it, and I'm different with you in it, and I don't want to go back to what it was before." He stopped. Then, with the specific difficulty of a man who has been careful with words for a long time and is now trying to be less careful, "I'm asking you to marry me. If you want to. If that's something you want." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the new barn was settling into the night the way new structures do, making the small sounds of wood contracting in the cooler air. Evelyn looked at Wyatt Callahan across the kitchen table, and she thought about the 11 days on the train and the platform in Magdalena, and the station agent's face when he told her. She thought about a barefoot child at a boarding house door speaking of her dead mother's instructions. She thought about a ledger with bad numbers and a burned barn and a letter she'd found in a wooden box and a community of people who had showed up with lumber because someone's wife had decided the thing was happening. She thought about what it meant to want something versus what it meant to need something, and whether she had ever in her adult life clearly distinguished between the two. "I came here to marry a man I'd never met based on 6 letters," she said. That was an enormous amount of hope to extend to a stranger. "It was," he said. "I know you considerably better than I knew Daniel." She paused. "I know you're bad at sleeping and good at listening. I know you think before you speak, and sometimes you think so long that the moment passes and you regret it. I know you kept your brother's horse for a year because you weren't ready to let go, and then sold it when it mattered because you were." She looked at him steadily. "I know this ranch. I know what it costs, and what it's worth, and what it could be." "What could it be?" he said. "Something real," she said. "Something built by people who understand what they're building and why." She paused. "Yes, Wyatt. I want to marry you." He looked at her. Something in his face did the thing it did very rarely. Opened, briefly, the way a door opens just enough to show you what's behind it before someone remembers to be careful. It was not a performed emotion. It was just the real one, surfacing for a moment before he put it back in order. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat there for a moment across the table with all the papers between them, and neither of them moved, and it was not a romantic moment in any way that songs get written about. It was 2 tired people at a kitchen table with cold coffee and a lamp burning down and a child asleep upstairs. But it was real in the way that only very specific, very honest things are real, and that was worth more than the other kind. They married in October, when the worst of the heat had broken and the light had gone to the particular quality that light had in New Mexico in the fall. Thinner, cleaner, with an edge to it that made distances look different. They married in the yard of the ranch in front of the new barn, with Justice Hennessy from town officiating in the direct way of a man who has conducted many frontier ceremonies and understands that the legal fact is what matters and the words around it should be honest and not too long. Clara Lester stood beside Evelyn. Wyatt had asked Ned Lester to stand beside him, which surprised Ned enough that he was briefly unable to respond, and then accepted with the gruff sincerity of a man who is moved and doesn't have a graceful vocabulary for it. Rose stood in front of both of them, directly in front, in the spot she had assigned herself that morning when they were working out the arrangement, with the absolute authority of a child who has decided where she belongs in a scene and is not open to alternative suggestions. She was wearing shoes. She had agreed to wear shoes for the ceremony and had done so without being asked twice, which Evelyn understood as a significant gesture. Marguerite Broussard cried, briefly and without apology, and her husband put his arm around her with the ease of a man who has done this enough times to know it doesn't require comment. Webb had gone back to Socorro after the repayment, but he had sent a letter that arrived 2 days before the wedding, short and plainly written, saying that he was glad the thing had turned out right and that he thought Craig Callahan would have been satisfied with how his journal was used. Evelyn had read the letter to Wyatt on the porch the evening it arrived, and he had listened without speaking, and afterward they had sat in the particular quiet of 2 people who are both thinking about someone who is not there, and that had been enough. The ceremony was brief. The vows were the traditional ones, which Evelyn had not wanted to modify because the traditional words had been worn smooth by enough use that they carried weight without needing decoration. She said them clearly and meant each one with the specific, grounded sincerity of someone who has thought carefully about what they are actually committing to. When it was done, Rose took both of their hands at once, her father's in her right, Evelyn's in her left, and stood between them and looked out at the assembled people in the yard of the ranch with the expression of someone surveying a situation that has arrived at its correct conclusion. "Are we done?" she said. "The ceremony part," Wyatt said. "Good," she said. Marguerite brought cake. Silas Crow left the county 14 months later. It did not happen dramatically. There was no public reckoning, no courtroom moment, no scene where he was made to account for what he had done in front of everyone he had wronged. The territorial investigation produced findings of questionable lending practices and one unresolved arson inquiry, which were submitted to the district attorney's office in Albuquerque, which determined there was insufficient evidence for criminal prosecution, which was not surprising and which Evelyn had always known was probable. What happened instead was slower and, in its way, more complete. Crow's business partners in Albuquerque, once the investigation findings became a matter of public record, began quietly distancing themselves. A land development company he had been negotiating with over the railroad easement pulled back from the deal, not with stated reasons, just with a sudden lack of correspondence that communicated everything. 2 banks declined to extend credit lines that had been routine. The territory was small enough and interconnected enough that a man with a documented pattern of predatory acquisition and an open arson investigation became a more expensive business partner than the same man without those things, and capital, which has very little sentiment, went where it was treated better. He sold his county holdings in the spring of the following year and relocated to Texas, where presumably the same qualities that had made him successful here would serve him well among people who did not yet know what he was. Evelyn was not naive enough to think the story ended there. Men like Crow did not become different people in different places. They found new ground, new moments of vulnerability, new people who needed money during bad years. The world was full of Crows. Knowing that was not hopelessness, it was just accuracy, which she had always preferred to the alternatives. What she held on to was the piece of it that had actually changed. Not the man, but the record. Craig Callahan's journal was on file with the sheriff's office and had been copied to the territorial land office. The signed statements from Clara Lester and the others were part of a documented case. Aldous Webb's sworn account of the trespass was in the permanent record. These things did not undo the harm Crow had done, but they existed in a way that the harm itself had not. Publicly, permanently, in a form that the next person could find if they needed it. That was something. It was not everything. It was something. The ranch grew in the way that working things grow, unevenly, with setbacks, through seasons that were harder than expected, and occasional seasons that were easier. The grazing lease arrangement that Wyatt had proposed generated returns that were modest and consistent, which Evelyn had come to prefer over the alternative. They paid the investors back over 2.5 years, every dollar, with a small return calculated from the lease income. And when the last agreement was settled, she sat with the closed ledger and felt the specific satisfaction of a completed obligation, which was one of the better feelings available. The cattle operation expanded carefully. Wyatt bought 30 head in the spring of the second year with money they had actually saved, which felt different from borrowed money in a way she hadn't fully understood until she experienced both. He made good decisions about breeding stock and decent decisions about timing, and one genuinely bad decision about a bull that turned out to have a disposition problem, and the bad decision cost them a difficult month, and then became a story he told on himself with the self-deprecating accuracy of a man who has stopped needing his own mistakes to reflect badly on him. Rose grew. This was the most obvious thing that happened, and in some ways the thing Evelyn was least prepared for, because children growing means constantly revising your understanding of who they are. The serious, watchful 7-year-old who had walked 5 miles in bare feet became a 9-year-old who had opinions about everything, and a 10-year-old who could calculate grazing yield per acre in her head, and an 11-year-old who had started teaching the Morales children to read on Saturday mornings, unprompted, because she had decided this was something that needed doing, and she was the available person to do it. She still didn't always wear shoes. On a Wednesday evening in the 3rd year, Evelyn was sitting on the porch after supper when Rose came and sat beside her in the manner she had, not asking, just arriving, as though proximity was the natural state of things. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, which was one of the things Evelyn had learned about Rose. She did not require conversation to be present with someone. "Do you ever think about Philadelphia?" Rose asked eventually. Evelyn thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," she said, "I think about my sister. I write to her." "Do you miss it?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because Rose asked questions that deserved seriousness. "I miss the library," she said. "There was a very good library, and my sister's cooking, which was better than mine." "Your cooking is fine." "It's adequate," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." Rose thought about this. "Do you wish you'd stayed?" "No," Evelyn said. It was the most honest answer available, and she had stopped giving any other kind. Rose leaned against her arm. It was the same gesture she had made on the wagon ride back from Magdalena after the repayment, and at the wedding, and on many evenings since, and it had moved from something Evelyn noticed to something she would notice only if it stopped. "I'm glad you came," Rose said. "I know," Evelyn said. "Even if Uncle Daniel—" "Even so," Evelyn said. "Yes." Wyatt came out of the house with his coffee and sat on the step below them and looked out at the ranch in the evening light, at the new barn that the community had built, at the east pasture where the railroad right-of-way cut a pale line through the grass, at the fence line that was now maintained correctly because there was time and money for maintenance and neither had felt guaranteed for a long time. "Greer's coming back next month," he said. "He wants to do a secondary assessment on the northwest section. Says the quartz formations there are different from the eastern claim." Evelyn looked at the back of his head. "You're not going to find silver, Wyatt." "Probably not," he said. "But Greer's not charging for the assessment. He's curious." She looked at the east pasture, at the light going amber over the grass, at the particular way the territory looked in the hours before dark when the distances were most themselves. She had tried, in the first months, to explain to her sister in letters what the landscape here looked like, and the letters had failed because language is not always the right tool. Some things you have to see from the inside. She had a life here now. Not the life she had come looking for, and not the life she had left behind, but something that had grown out of the space between those two things, built from hard work and imperfect people, and the specific stubbornness of refusing to leave when leaving would have been easier. She had not found this life. She had made it, in the way you make something that matters, slowly, imperfectly, with other people, out of the materials available. There was no moral she could hang on it cleanly. She had met people who wanted there to be a moral, who asked what the lesson was, who wanted the story to arrive at a statement they could carry around. She understood the desire. She had felt it herself. But the honest answer was that life rarely produced morals. It produced experiences, and the experiences changed you, and you carried the change forward into the next thing, and what you did with it was up to you. What she had done with it was this: a ranch in New Mexico territory. A man who thought carefully before he spoke and kept his dead brother's horse for a year and then let it go, and a child who had walked 5 miles in bare feet on the strength of a promise her mother had made before she died, and who had been right that Evelyn was the answer to that promise, even if neither of them had known it yet at the time. That was not a small thing. She had come to understand that clearly, over 3 years of mornings and working seasons and hard conversations at the kitchen table and evenings on the porch watching the light change. The small things, the $3 in the coat pocket, the wooden box on the lower shelf, the watch sold for $18 and the horse for $35, had added up to this. That was how it worked. Not in dramatic strokes, not through heroics, but through the accumulation of small, honest, stubborn acts repeated over time by people who had decided that the thing was worth doing. Rose fell asleep against her arm somewhere in the middle of the last of the light, as she sometimes did, and Wyatt stayed on the step below them without moving, and the ranch settled into the evening around them all, and the territory did what it always did, opened itself in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way of things that don't need you to find them beautiful, that simply are what they are regardless. Evelyn Hart, Evelyn Callahan. Now, though she thought of herself in both names, as people do when they have been more than one version of themselves, sat on the porch of the home she had not come looking for and had built anyway, and watched the last of the light go and did not wish for anything different. That was the whole of it. That was enough.